at all possible levels? Or, on the contrary, would this run counter to the interests of the West? Well, it all depends on how you determine those interests. Allow me to call your attention to the fact that Russian society has from ancient times been divided into two camps, pro-Western and anti-Western, Russophile. The pendulum has swung back and forth, and generally speaking, the anti-Western forces have been the victors, supported very strongly by the Russian Orthodox Church, which was anti-Western and remains anti-Western. However, there was a rupture in that fabric, a rupture that lasted for nearly 80 years. I'm alluding, of course, to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which come this fall will be celebrated in Russia by some and damned by others. Celebrated by the anti-Western Russian nationalist and chauvinist forces, and damned by those who dream of Russia as adhering to the values that have come to be defined by Western civilization. During those 80-odd years, all supporters of Western values, those who were traditionally referred to as Zapadniki, or Westernites, were purely and simply wiped out. Some did escape. Most of the others were killed. Not all. Some were quiet and said what they were supposed to say, while in the privacy of their kitchens spoke in hushed voices about the dreams that would never come true. Never, because no one believed that one day things would change. But change they did, and in the most incredible and dramatic way. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, launched perestroika and glasnost, a restructuring of the system and a liberalization of the media, kicking off a process that would lead to the breakup of the Soviet Union, to the true independence of the so-called Soviet satellites, and also of all the former Soviet republics. Russians began to travel, see a world they'd been denied. This was a victory for the pro-Western forces, a victory of unparalleled magnitude. And many thought the battle had been won. And yes, the battle had been won, but not the war. Now then, what will happen should the policy of excluding, isolating Russia continue? It will, beyond a question of the doubt, play into the hands of the most hawkish and anti-Western forces in Russia, who will be able to say, see, we told you so. We always said that America wants to weaken us, isolate us, destroy us. And it will be very hard, if not impossible, for those who support normal relations of Russia with the United States to find a plausible response to that. Should this trend continue, here's what will happen in Russia. The number of Russians studying abroad will be dramatically decreased and ultimately canceled. The number of Russians allowed to travel will be limited, as it was in Soviet times. Access to Western things such as movies, books, and media will be shut down. The internet will be controlled, as it is in China, or for that matter, to a certain extent in Ukraine, which strangely enough does not seem to bother the West. The absolutely free and highly diverse exchange of opinion that is typical of Russian social media today will be repressed. Freedom of speech, which does to a certain point exist today in Russia, will be curtailed. Russia will close in upon itself, bring down a much less porous Iron Curtain than before, thus becoming even less predictable. This will lead to a resumption of the hair-trigger relationship that typified the worst of the Cold War years. And now I ask, would this be in the national interests of the United States? I hold that it would not, and that conversely, a Russia integrated into the international community, a Russia not just brought in from the cold, but an included, not excluded Russia, is indeed in the national interests of the United States. And allow me to conclude by saying, this has nothing to do with being pro or anti-Russian. It has to do, to use an expression employed in a completely different area, it has to do with being pro-life. Thank you very much.
Vladimir Posner, thank you very much. The first speaker for the motion. Now the first speaker against the motion from Washington, Michael Hayden, former director of the CIA and also the National Security Agency under Bill Clinton and also under George W. Bush. Michael Hayden, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and let me tell you how delightful it is for me to be anywhere but Washington, D.C. at the moment. It's a wonderful motion. It's time to bring Russia in from the cold, and if we're voting on the last half of it, I would join Vladimir in saying that that's a good idea, because bringing Russia in from the cold would make it a better world. It's just not time. What even generates the question right now for all of us? What's new? What's different? What sharp turn in Russian policy have we witnessed that would suggest that we make a comparable turn? And when we bring Russia in from the cold, what are we bringing them into? And here I would suggest it's into a community of like-minded, like-valued, like-purposed, like-governed nations. And Russia is not currently in that community, and it's not in that community by choice. Not our choice, Russian choice. What we have seen in Russia for the past decade plus has been accelerated corruption, the corruption of democracy, of free markets, of the rule of law, the growth of authoritarianism, the suppression of political competition, the end of an independent judiciary, and a serious threat to snuff out anything resembling an independent press. All of this in a desperate attempt to justify what is unarguably an autocracy. And that autocracy is digging deeply into the well of Russian history to justify itself, going back to re-identifying Moscow as the third Rome, as morally superior to, well, you and me, in a corrupt and decadent West. Russia has chosen a dark chapter of its past. It has not chosen what could still be a bright future. And the Russia of today has grasped on to real and perceived historic grievances of the Russian people and has created, for its own purposes, a view for that people of an outside world that is relentlessly hostile, relentlessly anti-Russian. Now, the argument has been made that this is fundamentally our fault, that Russia has been threatened by NATO expansion and European Union expansion eastward toward the Russian borders. The threat to today's Russia is not comprised of NATO arms. The threat to today's Russia is comprised of NATO ideals. NATO practically disarmed. It was never an offensive alliance. And no reasonable military man in the Russian Federation today can picture NATO as being poised to threaten the Russian Federation. My army, which consistently, historically, has been the most powerful army within NATO, in the 15 years between 1997 and 2012, which is the period we're talking about here, went from 20 brigades on the continent of Europe to 2. Hardly a posture of threat to the Russian Federation. Bringing Russia in from the cold now, this Russia, really means concessions to this Russia. After all, this is our fault. This is our hostile policy that has created this serious rupture in relations. And so we're going to have to make concessions. We're going to have to self-correct if we're going to have a relationship with this Russia and allow them to join us. Otherwise, they will continue their self-imposed isolation. So we will have to halt NATO's Baltic deployment. We should end efforts to redress historic wrongs in the Ukraine, Georgia, and Crimea. We will be required to falsely rehabilitate Russia as a real counterterrorism partner to Europe and the United States. And then finally, we will all have to embrace collective amnesia for what the Russian Federation has done for their incredible electoral intervention into American and European electoral processes. Thank you.
Michael Hayden, thank you very much indeed. Now the second voice for the motion, Domitila Sacromoso, who is a top expert on conflict and security in Russia and Eurasia, and also on Russia's relations with NATO and the European Union. Lecturer in Security and Development at the Department of War Studies at King's College here in London. Domitila, the floor is yours.
Why? Why is it good to bring in Russia from